Hi there. My name is Renata Ramalhosa. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Beta in Brazil and Latin America. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to work in another event, Hacking Rio Talks, this time with 15 countries represented. Today I have a very special guest, Geoff Mulgan, who is going to give his perspective not just about the world, of the impact of this pandemic, but also and in particular about the UK. Welcome, Geoff. I'm going just to say about something about you. I mean, you have a long bio, which I'm not going to read it all, but I'm just going to say that you are currently a professor of collective intelligence, public policy, and social innovation at UCL, University College of London. But you are especially known for an amazing job that you did at NESTA, the Innovation Foundation in the UK, which is seen as a reference for the world on what it comes to social innovation, especially in the public sector. You obviously also have an extensive CV on advising government, in particular in the UK, about innovation in public policy, and you were also very involved in the Young Foundation, which was an inspiration, at least for me, during many years. So thank you very much, Geoff, for accepting my invitation to talk today. And I think what I would like to ask you to talk about, I know that you have a presentation, is really what do you think are the effects of this pandemic in the world and in particular in the UK? And what do you think are the new solutions emerging, the new thinking emerging out of this quarantine that we were all obliged to be in the past 4 months? Thank you, Geoff, again for accepting our invitation. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Renata, and it's very good to be with all of you in Rio. I've visited Brazil quite a few times, including many years ago when I used to work in government, running strategy in the British government, and then visiting the startup scenes in Rio, Sao Paulo, and so on. I have a sense of the incredible energy and creativity of your country, and indeed of the region. And what I will try and talk about is partly a UK perspective, but also maybe a global sense of how do we make this crisis useful and creative. Much of my work now is around the world with governments in East Asia and Europe and Africa, as well as here in the UK. And perhaps just to start with a word about the strangeness of this crisis. There are many features of this crisis which are strange. One is that we probably still are in the early stages of it, not the late stages. Another for young people is that although young people are relatively unaffected by the virus, young people are probably in some ways paying the highest price for it, both in lost education and as governments build up huge debts to pay for the crisis. Probably it will be young people who have to pay for it over many decades into the future. So I hope what I'm going to share with you is some ideas about some of the more creative, positive things coming out of the crisis, which I hope may spark some ideas, help you think about the business opportunities, social opportunities, new solutions. And I will share a little bit about a few pictures so you don't have to look at my face too much. And yeah, my interest is how do we make a crisis creative? If you look in history, almost any crisis, whether wars, civil wars, or recessions, they throw things up in the air and they do create new opportunities. And often some of the greatest ideas are born in the midst of a crisis. Maybe the same will be true this time. And if you look around the world, we have, I think, very different patterns in different countries. In some, probably the crisis is leading to damage and retreat. It is hurting not just the economy and institutions, and maybe it will take years to return. In some other countries already, things have bounced back. I'd call this a homeostatic crisis, where there's a shock, but then we get back to the normal of before. But I think in many countries, there's an interest in transformation. How do we use the crisis to solve underlying problems, to bounce forward? In the UK, an opinion survey recently said that only about 12% of people wanted to return back to normal. They wanted to see the crisis used to deal with issues of inequality or climate change, bad care for the elderly, and not just to get back to 2019. So interesting what the picture will be in Brazil and elsewhere. All around the world, I think different countries are in very different places in terms of these three options. Now, for me, what's been interesting is how this crisis has acted as a test of societies, of economies, and of leaderships. There have been many leaders in denial. President Trump, of course, recommended detergent as the solution, and there have been leaders in Africa, Madagascar and Tanzania, who promised that herbal remedies would solve COVID. Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua made some equally crazy comments. For me, though, what's interesting when a whole society faces a crisis is how can we pull together? How do we learn new ways of defending ourselves and cooperating and collaborating and acting as a collective, a little bit like these very beautiful fish just off your coast. And most of what I'm going to talk about are some of the new tools and new technology tools which help us act a little bit more like this rather than being victims of the sharks and the threats. Some of this is work which I began with a book a few years ago called Big Mind on collective intelligence. And in a way, its question was, how does a society or an economy do all the things we do in our brains, which is we observe, we have models of the world, we predict, we remember, we empathize, we create. This, in a way, was an issue for many fields, but the crisis has made it much sharper, because the countries which have done best through the crisis are the ones which have learned how to create a kind of shared brain, a collective intelligence for understanding what is happening and acting very fast, very agile, very dynamically in response to it. So here's a few examples from around the world. Top left is Korea, where I do a lot of work. And their very clever use of mobile phone data, credit card data, drive-in testing meant right from the start they got a grip of the crisis and kept the death rate very, very low. On the top right, you see an image from Taiwan. Again, a fantastic tech scene there who worked very closely with civil society and the government, again, to track infections, to implement what they call digital fences for quarantines. If you're interested, I recently did in fact it's tomorrow, but it won't be tomorrow, a session with the digital minister in Taiwan looking at what they did. And he's a hacker. She, Audrey, is a transgender hacker who became Minister of Digital Technology in the government and therefore brought a hacking mentality in a way which has almost no parallels. In the middle is Singapore's tracing app, which they put in place 4 months ago. Bottom left, Bangladesh, which is not a country we always think of as being at the technological forefront, but they had a very smart team, almost like a startup team within government called A2I, who put together what they called a collective data intelligence system to organize really the national brain through the crisis, to handle both the healthcare, but also the income support, the job support in ways which are well ahead of North America or Europe. And then the bottom right is China, which has had to pioneer these new sort of traffic light systems for knowing who can go where and when out of Wuhan, using often the commercial platforms, Alibaba and Tencent, to help manage the recovery process when some people may be immune, some people in time will be vaccinated, and other people may still be vulnerable. So these examples, all from Asia, I will come to other ones, are in some ways the cutting edge of organizing intelligence at the scale of a whole society in very detailed ways to spot infections, contacts, and to act very quickly to contain its spread. And they have worked very, very well, far better than the US, UK, France, Italy, Spain, these other countries, which perhaps a generation or two ago would have been right in the forefront. And they're all in a way learning from the experiences of the collective intelligence field more generally, bits of which you will know, like Wikipedia, which organizes tens of millions of people to share knowledge about the world. Examples like Zooniverse in science, which has 1 million+ volunteers helping to work with scientists to understand problems. And examples which you have in Rio, like Waze, which works with Google and others to turn a city's transport system into a living shared brain. And these are all pointers to, I think, where we might be in 5 or 10 years, 15 years time in almost every field of life, where rather than just having commercial platforms taking our data, sending adverts to us, we go a step beyond that to something which truly is a shared intelligence, able to solve problems, able to deal with crises. And this is a very global phenomenon. So here's one from Africa, which we are now copying in the UK. This is WeFarm, which links more than 1 million farmers, so that if a farmer has a problem, they post it in SMS. Using clever artificial intelligence, they find another farmer who has a solution, and then they quickly send an SMS back to the first farmer offering the answer. So it turns more than 1 million farmers into, again, a shared intelligence. Now that's exactly what we've often needed through the COVID crisis for nurses and doctors in real time to share lessons of what is working, what isn't working, and so on. And yeah, now we're importing it from Africa. Though in fact, this was a British project, so we can take a little bit of pride in initiating this, even though it's implemented in Africa. My former organization, NESTA, runs a thing called challenges.org, which has worked a bit in Latin America, which is using these collective intelligence methods to solve problems. So you post a problem, offering sometimes a financial reward, and anyone can offer a solution, an entrepreneur, an innovator, but they have to show it works. And if it works, they get paid for their ideas. And in a little bit later, I'll show how some of this is being applied to COVID. Now, in the US, this has become quite mainstream in organizations like NASA. So back in the 60s, NASA used to have armies of scientists building rockets and spacesuits and so on. But now, to some extent, they've turned it inside out. So for many, many different tasks, from designing the software for spacecraft or spacesuits or corporate videos, they open it up so anyone can contribute. So NASA has been transformed using collective intelligence methods which try to tap into millions of people's brains all over the world, rather than just the ones within the organization. And I think this is the model for the future of governments and businesses and NGOs, that they become much smarter at mobilizing creativity, intelligence, wherever it may be. Some businesses find this quite easy. Lego is one based in Denmark, which you will know, which for 10 years has used its users, its consumers, as a source of ideas and creativity to come up with new product ideas. And more businesses are copying them. Now I want to give one example from the UK, which has really come into its own during the crisis. And it's an example which we helped really design and incubate at NESTA. And this was really a startup called Good Sam, which was a response to the problem of heart attacks and the emergencies on the street. So if you have a heart attack on the streets in Rio, if you're on the street, it may take 10, 15 minutes for an ambulance to get to you, and there's quite a high likelihood you will not survive. If you have a heart attack in a hospital, you have a 50% chance of surviving because they have the doctors and the equipment there. And actually, if you're somewhere like an airport, your chances are pretty good because there are defibrillators in airports and stations. But our question was, how could we reduce that risk for people just getting a heart attack or some emergency on the street? And so the idea of Good Sam was to create a smartphone-based app which could mobilize trained volunteers who could get to you quicker than the ambulance, so that even before the ambulance arrived, they could stabilize you, perhaps bring a defibrillator, and greatly reduce the risk of you dying. And that worked very well. It's a simple idea. It mobilizes citizen power alongside the doctors and the health system and the ambulances to save lives. And by last year, that was spreading all over the world with tens of thousands of volunteers, and it was being integrated into ambulance systems all over the world. then the crisis hit. And what's been interesting during the COVID crisis is that people wanted to help. They wanted to contribute in some ways. So the government actually used the Good Sam app as a place for people to volunteer to be helpers in their hospitals, to help visit old people, to help drive them to hospital. And I think to everyone's amazement, 750,000 people volunteered to help through the Good Sam app, which you can see on the right-hand side there. And so this is an example of a it's always technologically quite sophisticated project, run almost as a hacking startup, but attached to the National Health Service, then becoming a route for huge numbers of people, not just to be observers of the crisis, but to play a part in it. And I've just shown here two other examples of interesting sort of hacking solutions to the crisis. On the top left-hand corner is one from Brooklyn in New York, where a group of programmers and really hackers pulled together a whole series of off-the-shelf tech tools. I don't know if you can see them all, from Twilio and Airtable and so on, to create a community service for delivering food to people who were vulnerable and suffering through the crisis. So it was kind of, almost a do-it-yourself, but quite technologically sophisticated community project, hacking different elements of software to create a new kind of service. And the bottom left is one of many which have sprung up through the crisis to support vulnerable older people, again, using platform technology to make it easier to organize circles of support around an 80-year-old or a 90-year-old who needs a bit of help, their shopping done for them, some visits. And these have happened spontaneously, coming up from civil society to solve the problems which perhaps government couldn't solve and the big retailers couldn't solve. There are thousands of examples around the world of these using collective intelligence to make society able to be creative in its response to the crisis. There have also been quite a few in science of mobilizing people to help solve the science problems of the crisis. So Foldit is an example which has been going for a long time, a collective intelligence platform for designing antiviral proteins. Thousands of people taking part, really in the leading edge of science, working alongside scientists. And all over the world, similar things for both COVID detection, but also increasingly for designing protective equipment for the health service. And I've been working with others with the United Nations in the last few months, and many, many countries are now putting in place these collective intelligence solutions to speeding up the provision of masks and equipment for health services, which are often struggling, particularly in parts of Africa and India. So again, it's mobilizing all the resources of the society, using clever technology, often a bit of a hacker mindset, to solve problems. I just want to end with a couple of words about looking ahead. So one of the things which has been really interesting me in recent months really is how we use this crisis creatively and how we imagine and build a society for 5, 10, 20 years time, which really does solve some of the deep problems which have been made much more visible through the crisis. And in this little paper, which was published a couple of months ago in Finland, I looked at this, what I call the imaginary crisis, by which I don't mean this crisis is imaginary. It's not at all. It's very real. Millions of people are dying. I mean more, we have a crisis of our imaginations. That my guess is that most of you, if you're like people your age anywhere else in the world, you find it quite easy to imagine things getting much worse. You can imagine climate change disaster. You've probably watched lots of movies where artificial intelligence takes over the world and, enslaves the humans. And we've almost grown up to expect dystopia, not utopia. And to the extent we have an imaginary of the future, it's often only technological. We see a future of smart cities and smart homes and AI, but we've almost lost the ability to imagine what could, a neighborhood look like, or democracy, or care for children, or care for the elderly in 1 or 2 generations' time. So we started this project now out of Demos Helsinki with dozens of organizations across the world, quite a few here in the UK and Germany and the US and elsewhere, to collectively try to imagine better what could we hope for in the medium to long term, sometimes using technologies, but above all being very attuned to human need, our need for each other, our need for social support, our need for care, our need for happiness. So if you're interested, have a read of that. But above all, Brazil is a country which should be at the forefront of our shared global imagination of how a society could be better. And one of the gifts, the possible gifts of this crisis, is perhaps to remind us of the need not just to fix the crisis, but to imagine better what might come next. So I'll stop there, Renata, and I hope that's a little bit of food for thought, at least.
Oh, yes. Amazing food for thought. Thank you very much for a fascinating talk and examples. I mean, in your first sort of slide, you mentioned some of the examples in Asia and Africa, in a sort of as opposed to the Occident and what really the Western world has been able to react collectively into this crisis. I mean, do you see a sort of, globally speaking, do you see a shift in the way the world is reacting to these new events like the COVID-19? I mean, do you see that the Western world is actually quite incapable to react collectively as opposed to other countries, as you shown, such as, in Thailand, Bangladesh, etc.? I mean, how do you see globally the government and the societies reacting into this crisis?
Yeah, so the short answer is the reactions have been very uneven, and it makes it hard to generalize. I think probably a generation or two ago, it was assumed that the governments, the civil services of the richest countries, US, Japan, UK, France, would be the most competent at almost dealing with any kind of crisis. And that has not been the case this year at all. We've had a very, very complicated pattern where the best performers have included some of the countries I showed, like South Korea, Taiwan, but also New Zealand has done very well. Vietnam has done very well. In Europe, Greece, Austria, Germany performed very well, whereas some of the, Italy, Spain, the UK, France have struggled. The US is probably having the worst crisis of any country at the moment. It has really revealed deep, deep flaws in how its government systems work, which aren't all to the blame of Donald Trump, though quite a few of them are, a country which probably assumed it was the best in the world. And it's clearly the geography of performance is very different. So for countries like the UK, I think it means we have to be humble. We have to be willing to learn from those who are objectively doing best and learn lessons about how we can make our governments smarter, more agile, better at solving problems, and not assume that we are the center of solutions. In Latin America, I know the patterns are very, very uneven as well. You don't need me to tell you which countries are doing well and which countries are doing badly. I think one of the big differences, though, is that this is a crisis it's a biological crisis. It's a material fact. So you can't combat it with words. And the countries which have done well are the ones which in some ways, I think, clear enough about the science that they deal with it objectively rather than just issuing press releases or speeches or slogans. They recognize it as a material biological fact. And again, with some humility, they try to deal with it. Whereas those leaderships who become intoxicated with their own words have not done very well at all.
Yes, and you also mentioned education as one of the struggles of this crisis. I mean, suddenly all our children were having online classes. I mean, and obviously some of the public schools were not ready, and even the private schools ready to kind of deliver education remotely. I mean, how do you see that this can impact positively education for the future? Because, you know, we were waiting also for some transformation in this sector for a while. So is it now the moment, or do we still have to wait?
Well, I work in a university which is having to completely rethink how it works. So I think in a number of fronts, the crisis will achieve in 1 year what might otherwise have taken 10 years in terms of changes of use of digital. That's clearly true in workplaces. Many workplaces will not go back to where they were before. They will make much more use of Zoom and Teams and Skype and so on, and save people time in commuting. In schools, I'm sure we will see continued use of much more online teaching, and probably using the classroom and the face-to-face, not just for learning content, but for the more social discussions, argument part of education. The same in universities. Lectures don't have to all happen in a physical hall. In some ways, it's better to watch a lecture on a screen and take notes, but then you do need people to come together to talk, to reflect, to think about what they've learned. So I don't think we'll see a complete replacement of face-to-face education with online, but I think we will see a much smarter combination of the two. And this will be challenging. It'll be particularly challenging in many countries for those kids who don't have easy access to the internet, or don't have supportive parents, or don't have a quiet room to go to learn. So in a way, it's forcing the education system to look at inequality in a new way. But I am quite optimistic. I think some of the benefits, some of the effects will be beneficial in the long run, because in a way, it's amazing how slow education has been to make full use of the extraordinary technologies available free on the internet even now.
Yes, I mean, one of the main topics of the EC in Rio this year is human city and smart city. I mean, and you also talked about that in your in your talk earlier. I mean, we see a lot of more volunteers, and in Brazil, for example, and a better sense of giving and empathy in societies that probably have, a stronger social sort of difference in terms of their society. Do you think that this crisis will sustain, or once this crisis is over, and maybe we'll have others, do you think these levels of human city and empathy and willing to support others and willing to have this more even society will be sustained, or we will go back to what we used to have?
So I hope that we will see through this crisis a turning point in how we think about the smart city. So I have a background in telecommunications. That's my PhD. I have been to more events and projects on smart cities over the years than I care to admit. But the problem with most of the things which use the smart city label is they mainly meant the physical things of the city becoming smart, the movement of transport or energy. And they basically thought the people would just be passive observers of this and be grateful for the wonderful things done by IBM or Cisco or Google for them. Now, this idea of the smart city, I think, has become increasingly anachronistic for two main reasons. One is that people no longer are happy seeing their data taken by those companies or by the city council. So 3 months ago, right at the beginning of this crisis, Google had to close down its leading demonstration in the world, which was Sidewalk Labs in Toronto, which was meant to be the showcase of their vision of the smart city. And essentially the people of Toronto said, we don't trust you to take our data. We don't think this is in our interest, this vision of the smart city. And then the other issue is this one about the human. So a true smart city is one which can mobilize the brain power, the passion, the commitment of all the people to solve its problems, improve its environment. Is not one where these are done to people or just for them. It has to be a vision of smartness with the people. And again, this was very hard for the engineers. I'm now in an engineering department at University College London. I love engineers, but they're sometimes not so good at understanding the human dimension. So I hope we are moving towards a much more, a much richer notion of the smart city. And for me, collective intelligence is a good sort of language for talking about that. How does Rio or Sao Paulo or Brasilia, become more than the sum of its parts, really tap the creativity, the passion, all the things of its citizens, and not just smart street lamps or roads and so on. That's where I hope we will head in the next 10 years. And I think within the big companies, people are beginning to understand this. And as I say, the failure of Sidewalk Labs in Toronto probably will look like a historic turning point, because there was so much invested in that slightly cold, slightly inhuman vision of the smart city. And it turns out not to work either socially or commercially.
Absolutely. You also gave us a lot of examples of apps, technologies that are helping people to kind of come together to solve problems, but we haven't really seen that at a global level. And I know that you talk a lot about this global governance and how this crisis actually failed to bring global collaboration to tackle it in a more efficient way. Do you think that we are now better than in the beginning? Do you think that there are some technologies emerging that will allow countries to share more, people from not just from their own countries, but from all over the world, to sort of think collectively to solve the global challenges, which are not just COVID, as you said. We have climate change, we have many other global challenges that we will be facing, and we are facing, that we need to solve it together.
So I think there's a paradox. Many of the examples I showed are maybe rooted in one nation, but they're then offered to the whole world, or they have a global dimension. The citizen science projects like Foldit on antiviral proteins, or something like Good Sam, which was offered open source for dozens of countries to copy. The technology is almost sort of inherently global, not national. And yet the crisis has been a bad crisis for global institutions. They have not played a big role. The UN, even the WHO, they have been observers, and nearly all the action has been within nations and led by national governments. And that's partly because we are in a period when the big powers are not very keen on multilateral global governance, especially the US. To some extent, China has not worked out what it thinks. Russia tends to be hostile. So I think our global institutions are strangely weak at a time when the technologies should make it easier to organize globally, when our problems are truly global in nature, like COVID and climate change, and the jobs challenges of automation. So one of my hopes for the next 10 years, I guess, is that we will begin to see, firstly, a new alignment of global leaders. Perhaps a new president in the US will be able to find, common cause with Europe and China and others. I hope we will see the reinvention of global institutions. Most of our United Nations ones were designed in the 1940s, and they are not what we would design now if we were starting with the current problems and capabilities of the world. So, for example, there is no global institution with any power devoted to data or knowledge or information, even though in the economy, the most valuable companies in the world are all based on data, knowledge, and information. If you look at the top 10, they're no longer banks and oil, they're all based on intangibles, and yet our governance structures are 30, 40, 50 years behind that. So there's a lot of work to be done, perhaps by some of the generation taking part here, in really bringing our global capabilities into line with our needs and our technologies. But this is a slow process. My hope is this crisis, as probably the first ever truly global crisis experienced as global in real time, will change people's attitudes and will open up a bit more space for some creativity here. But so far, it's not been a great story this year.
Absolutely, yes. I was going to, I mean, we need to give it a close to our fascinating talk, but I was going to ask you whether you feel optimistic about the future and whether you think that all the wisdom that you shared with us so far, some of it at least will happen. And another thing is whether you have a message specifically to Brazil. I mean, this is obviously an initiative in Rio. Hack in Rio is one of the largest hackathons in Latin America, with a lot of young people that are coming together to develop solutions for the future. Is there any particular message that you would like to convey to them in a sort of a positive wisdom that allow us to keep our optimistic levels high?
Well, on your first question, I am quite pessimistic in the short term. I think the next 12 months will be difficult for the world. I think we will see second and third waves of COVID. We will see in some countries a deepening recession, accelerating job loss, and a lot of people really struggling, perhaps harder in the second half of the crisis than the first half. But in the long run, I'm actually quite optimistic. I think this will dislodge some issues. I think it will create all sorts of new opportunities. I hope it creates a stronger global consciousness. And I guess for young people in Rio and across Brazil, my main encouragement would be fearless. This is a time of a lot of fear, and it's a time of, in some ways, shrinking opportunities for so many young people. They can't go to college, they're stuck, they can't earn. It feels like their horizons are narrowing in. And I would urge you, coming from a country which is so incredibly dynamic and creative in its people, not to be frightened by that, to keep an eye on the long term, keep an eye on the horizon when, as always with a crisis, new things will become possible, and be the person who spots the possibility amidst the crisis. And if you can do that, you can really help the world for the better.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Geoff. I know that you are in the UK. I'm in Portugal. Lindalia and the rest of the team is in Brazil. So there is something good about this crisis, which is we are all talking together in different parts of the world. Thank you very much for your time, for your wisdom, for your intelligence. And I give it to a close. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Take care.